In the winter of 1879, two children were found speaking a language that didn't exist. The Hartwell twins of Richmond, Virginia could communicate perfectly with each other, but when they tried to speak to anyone else, only silence came out. Their parents thought it was a phase. The doctors called it impossible. But when the townspeople started hearing the twins' voices coming from empty rooms at night, whispering secrets about the living and the dead, they realized something far more sinister was happening. This is the story of Mary and Thomas Hartwell and the dark truth behind their silent curse. The Hartwell family seemed ordinary enough when they arrived in Richmond in the fall of 1878. Jonathan Hartwell, a tobacco merchant from North Carolina, had purchased a modest house on Clay Street with his wife Elizabeth and their 6-year-old twins. The house had been empty for nearly 3 years after the previous owner died under mysterious circumstances, but Jonathan got it for a fraction of its worth. Mary and Thomas were identical in every way except gender. They had the same pale green eyes, the same shock of dark hair, and the same unsettling habit of finishing each other's sentences. But what the neighbors first noticed wasn't their appearance. It was their silence. The twins never spoke to adults. Not to their parents, not to the shopkeeper, not to the pastor at Sunday service. When someone asked them a question, they would look at each other, and Mary would whisper something in Thomas's ear. Then Thomas would nod, and they would both smile and walk away without saying a word. Elizabeth Hartwell assured the concerned neighbors that her children were simply shy. They spoke plenty at home, she claimed, just not around strangers. But Mrs. Patterson, who lived next door, began to suspect something wasn't right when she heard voices coming from the twins' bedroom at all hours of the night. The voices weren't speaking English. They weren't speaking any language Mrs. Patterson had ever heard. The sounds were musical, almost like singing, but with words that seemed to twist and bend in ways that human tongues shouldn't be able to manage. When she mentioned this to Elizabeth, the woman's face went pale. That's when Elizabeth admitted the truth. The twins had never spoken to her or Jonathan, not once. They communicated with each other constantly, but whenever an adult tried to join the conversation, the children would fall completely silent. It was as if their voices simply didn't work for anyone else. Dr. Samuel Morrison, Richmond's most respected physician, examined the twins in December of 1878. He found nothing wrong with their throats, their tongues, or their hearing. Mary and Thomas could understand English perfectly. They followed instructions, nodded when spoken to, and even smiled at jokes, but they would not speak. During the examination, Dr. Morrison tried an experiment. He separated the twins, taking Mary into one room while Thomas waited in another. Within minutes, both children began to show signs of distress. Mary's breathing became rapid and shallow. Thomas started rocking back and forth in his chair. When Dr. Morrison tried to calm Mary by speaking to her, she acted as if she couldn't hear him at all. But here's what disturbed the doctor most. Even though the twins were in separate rooms, he could hear Mary responding to something. She was having a conversation, nodding and shaking her head, occasionally letting out small laughs. When he asked who she was talking to, Mary looked at him with confusion, as if the question made no sense. The same thing was happening with Thomas in the other room. Dr. Morrison's assistant later swore that he could hear 2 voices coming from Mary's room, even though only Mary was inside. The second voice sounded exactly like Thomas, but softer, more distant. When they brought the twins back together, both children immediately relaxed and began their strange musical conversation again. Word of the Hartwell twins spread through Richmond like wildfire. Some people called it a medical marvel. Others whispered about darker possibilities. The twins had moved into a house where the previous owner, an elderly woman named Catherine Mills, had died alone. Mrs. Mills had been found 3 days after her death, and neighbors reported hearing her talking to someone right up until the night she died. But Mrs. Mills lived alone and never had visitors. If you're finding this story as disturbing as the people of Richmond did, make sure you're subscribed, because the truth about what happened to the Hartwell twins gets much darker than anyone could have imagined. By the spring of 1879, the twins' behavior had become even more unsettling. They would stand in front of mirrors for hours, apparently having conversations with their reflections. But observers noticed that their reflection conversations didn't match their mouth movements. It was as if they were speaking to something else entirely, something only they could see. Mrs. Patterson reported hearing children's laughter coming from the Hartwell house at night. But when she looked out her window, she could see Mary and Thomas sleeping peacefully in their beds. The laughter was coming from somewhere else in the house. Empty rooms, according to Elizabeth Hartwell, who had searched the house multiple times. The situation reached a breaking point in May of 1879, when Thomas became seriously ill with pneumonia. The doctor insisted the boy needed complete rest and isolation. For the first time since birth, Mary and Thomas were separated for more than a few hours. That's when the real horror began. With Thomas bedridden and barely conscious, Mary began having conversations with empty air. She would sit in the parlor, responding to questions no one else could hear, laughing at jokes that weren't told, and sometimes arguing with increasing intensity. But the most chilling part was that townspeople walking past the house could hear both sides of the conversation. They could hear Thomas's voice, clear as day, even though Thomas was upstairs, unconscious with fever. Reverend William Hayes decided to investigate. As a man of God, he felt responsible for the spiritual welfare of his congregation, and the Hartwell situation had begun to frighten the entire community. On the evening of May 15th, he sat with Mary in the parlor while her parents tended to Thomas upstairs. According to Reverend Hayes's detailed account, written the same night, Mary carried on a normal conversation with her invisible brother for over an hour. The Reverend could hear Thomas's responses as clearly as if the boy were sitting right next to his sister. Thomas's voice answered questions about his health, discussed the weather, and even asked the Reverend about Sunday's sermon. But when Reverend Hayes went upstairs to check on Thomas, he found the boy in a deep, feverish sleep. Thomas's breathing was labored, and he hadn't regained consciousness in over 18 hours. According to Dr. Morrison, Thomas was closer to death than recovery. Yet downstairs, his voice continued talking to Mary. Reverend Hayes confronted Mary directly. He asked her who she was talking to. Mary looked at him with those pale green eyes and spoke her first and only words to an adult. "Thomas is always with me. Thomas is always here." Her voice was barely a whisper, and according to the Reverend, it sounded nothing like a child's voice. It was older, weathered, and carried an accent he couldn't place. Thomas died 3 days later. The funeral was small and quiet. Mary stood beside the grave, completely silent once again. But as they lowered Thomas's coffin into the ground, several people in attendance later swore they heard a child's voice calling out from beneath the earth. Not screaming or crying, but talking, as if Thomas were trying to continue a conversation. Mary never spoke to another living person again, but that didn't mean she stopped talking. For months after Thomas's death, neighbors continued to hear both children's voices coming from the Hartwell house. The conversations grew longer and more intense. Sometimes they sounded playful, like normal children playing games. Other times they sounded urgent, almost desperate. Elizabeth Hartwell began showing signs of severe mental strain. She told Dr. Morrison that Mary still acted as if Thomas were alive. The girl would set 2 places at the table, save half her food for her dead brother, and spend hours playing games that required 2 people. Most disturbing of all, Elizabeth swore that sometimes, late at night, she could see Thomas. Not clearly, she explained, but like a shadow that moved wrong, or a reflection that appeared when no one was there to cast it. She began to believe that Thomas hadn't really died, that somehow he was still with Mary, still having their endless conversations in their strange, musical language. Dr. Morrison recommended that Mary be sent to an institution for her own safety and the family's peace of mind. But before arrangements could be made, something happened that changed everything. On a cold October morning, Mrs. Patterson found Mary Hartwell sitting on her front steps. The child was perfectly still, staring straight ahead with those pale green eyes. When Mrs. Patterson approached, Mary looked up and smiled. "Thomas says goodbye," Mary whispered in that same old, weathered voice. Then she closed her eyes and never opened them again. Dr. Morrison's examination found no cause of death. Mary's body showed no signs of illness, injury, or distress. She had simply stopped living, as if someone had blown out a candle. But here's what the doctor's report didn't include, what the Hartwell family never told anyone, and what Mrs. Patterson kept secret until her death 40 years later. When they found Mary that morning, she wasn't alone on the steps. There was a second set of footprints in the morning frost, small footprints, the size of a 6-year-old boy's shoes. The footprints led from the Hartwell house to where Mary was sitting, then disappeared completely. But the footprints weren't the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part was that Mrs. Patterson could still hear voices coming from the Hartwell house. 2 children, talking and laughing together. Their conversation continuing as if nothing had changed. As if death was just another room they could visit whenever they wanted. The Hartwell house stood empty for 6 months before Jonathan and Elizabeth moved away. During those 6 months, people walking past reported hearing children's voices at all hours. Not just Mary and Thomas, but other voices too. Children who had died years before the twins were born, all talking together in that same musical language that no living person could understand. Mrs. Catherine Mills, the previous owner who had died alone, had mentioned something strange in her final letter to her niece. She wrote that she was never really alone in the house because the children visited her every night. Children who wanted to tell her about the place where words never end and conversations last forever. The house on Clay Street was eventually torn down in 1901, but workers reported hearing voices coming from the walls as they demolished each room. The lot remained empty for decades because every family that tried to build there reported the same thing. Children's voices, coming from underground, speaking in a language that sounded like music and felt like memory. Today, a modern apartment building sits where the Hartwell house once stood. Most residents don't know about Mary and Thomas, and the property managers don't volunteer the information. But some tenants have reported strange occurrences. Children's voices coming through the walls, conversations in empty hallways, and sometimes, late at night, the sound of 2 children playing games that require perfect understanding between participants.
The maintenance staff has learned not to investigate these sounds, because the last person who tried to follow the voices found something in the basement that convinced him never to speak of what he'd seen.
Something that suggests Mary and Thomas Hartwell are still having their conversations, still speaking their private language, and still collecting new friends to join their eternal